Welcome to the VO2 Lounge Coaching Podcast. If you're new, sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. If you're a returning listener and have not already done so, please feel free to rate the show and share it with your friends. It's the best way to support the show and help the podcast grow. If you'd like to become an athlete at the VO2 Lounge Coaching, then email me at the vo2lounge@gmail.com, which you can find down in the description. I take on athletes of all different calibers, whether you're looking to take on your first sportive, just getting into the sport, or targeting a win at a national road race. I'm here to support you in whatever your goals may be. Now for this episode. This is somewhat of a rerun of my most downloaded episode to date, which was on hot and cold exposure. My delivery back then wasn't quite as good, the audio quality wasn't as good, and many new listeners would not have listened to the episode yet. It felt like doing it disjustice just re-uploading it and adding a little bit of a intro at the beginning to explain some of the background and so on and so forth. So I thought I'd re-go through my notes, readjust them in places, rewrite them in places, and just deliver it fresh for everyone to listen to. So let's get into the episode. Hot and cold exposure has seen a recent surge in popularity with various new devices emerging on the market. In doing some research for this, I was just getting inundated almost with these like bod pods and all these other kind of different saunas, like things that people can either put themselves in to control a cold bath of water, essentially an expensive ice bath. Now, this trend is driven by reports of significant health benefits, in particular a reduction in all-cause mortality. People often report feeling more stimulated and motivated after cold exposure, whether through ice baths or cold showers. And in this episode, we'll focus mainly on the health benefits of the combination of hot and cold exposure, though we'll also touch on some of the other more subjective benefits. Now, of course, training more is going to result in improved performance benefit, but often people like to have other ways to relax and wind down during heavy training phases and kind of in the off season as well, just to do something a little bit different. And hot and cold exposure can be just that. So let's go into some of the benefits, some high level bits of information on what we'll be covering today, and before we get into the real kind of in-depth minutiae of everything. Firstly, regular hot and cold exposure is associated with decreased cardiovascular and all-cause mortality. And this suggests that incorporating these practices into one's routine can contribute to a longer, healthier life. All-cause mortality, if you don't already know, is just basically death from everything essentially that is an accidental death. So cancer, it can be heart attack, it could be anything. Now, exposure to hot and cold temperatures has been shown to lower the incidence of hypertension, so high blood pressure. This is partly due to the reduction in blood pressure that can result from these practices. Now, regular exposure can also reduce the incidence of respiratory disease. The mechanisms behind this include improved immune function and respiratory efficiencies. There is evidence suggesting that hot and cold exposure can reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. This benefit is linked to improved blood flow and reduced arterial stiffness, which enhances brain health, essentially through likely the improved blood flow to the brain, which is an organ. Both hot and cold, mechanisms behind this. Now, both hot and cold exposure can lead to vasodilation and vasoconstriction, respectively. So vasoconstriction, the shrinking of essentially like veins and arteries. Vasodilation, their expansion, and obviously the cold environment is going to cause that constriction, whereas dilation is going to be as a result of the heat, like the high temperatures. Now these both help in regulating blood pressure. The contrast in temperatures can induce a relaxation response, reducing stress and improving overall mental health. This is probably one of the main pieces, I think, where it's most beneficial to athletes is definitely especially for someone who's on a training block or has the time and doesn't have other things they need to get to do and they're already training a large amount, or this is, say you're lucky enough to have a sauna at home and you're, say, substituting this for time with your partner on the sofa watching TV. You're just both, using a sauna. This relaxation and almost mindfulness practice in a way that's going to come with this to some extent is what I think one of the biggest benefits really is that time, not necessarily alone, because you could be doing it with other people, but without technology, without other stimuluses, and just switching off for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, and just focusing on the present time as it is. Increased sweating and fluid loss, which helps in detoxification and can improve skin health. Reduced arterial stiffness and improved endothelial function. These improvements enhance cardiovascular health, reducing the risk of related disease. So just the effectiveness at which your arteries are able, and veins and vasculature are able to contract and dilate and so on. The additional benefits: improved cognition and mental health. Exposure to varying temperatures has been linked to enhanced cognitive function and mental health, potentially due to the release of endorphins and improved circulation. Improved health of the endocrine system. This includes better hormonal balance, which can affect everything from metabolism to mood. Improved immune respiratory function. Regular hot and cold exposure can boost immune response and enhance respiratory function, reducing susceptibility to illness. From these points, it's clear why interest in the topic has peaked. The potential health benefits are substantial, and the subjective improvements in motivation and well-being add an extra layer of appeal to people. And I think it is definitely twofold. There is definitely an element where this is founded in research and legitimate health, positive health outcomes, whether they're mental health outcomes, whether they're physical health outcomes. That's definitely the case. As to how big they are in different populations is a different story. But with the birth of different pieces of household technology that you can utilize to facilitate this, that are not freezers that have had ice put in them and turned on their side, like chest freezers, what you saw people do where they seal them up. Stuff that is easy to control the bacteria content. It's not inconvenient like buying loads of ice. Saunas themselves still a chore to set up to some extent, but there's all these different methods of doing it. Maybe you find them more frequently in gyms and so on and so forth. But definitely with things like the Huberman Lab pushing it or advocating for it, Joe Rogan Experience that also has put these forward a lot. You've got the Tier Drive, less so, but definitely the first two I mentioned are big proponents of it. And then almost every medium-sized, I'd say large-size influencer that's new into some kind of endurance sport is talking about the efficacy of ice baths. You've got Premier League football teams and all these using cryotherapy. Of course, we are talking here about hot and cold therapy, whereas I think the cold therapy side of things is what gets people in, because I think when you first experience it, there is like a euphoric rush almost of the challenge and the discomfort and just the cold shock that comes with it. But let's not lose sight of the fact that this is hot and cold therapy. Now, the origins of hot and cold therapy is not necessarily a recent one. So bathing in heat for the purposes of purification or cleansing and healing is quite an ancient practice, observed it for thousands of years across many cultures. Variations of this appear in the form of the banyas in Russia, sweat lodges of the American Indians, and then, of course, saunas of Finland. Now, sauna use, sometimes referred as sauna bathing, which is characterized by short-term passive exposure to high temperatures, typically ranging from 45 to 100 degrees Celsius, not Fahrenheit, Celsius. 100 degrees, you could probably cook something slowly, but you could cook something in that definitely, depending on the modality used. Longer exposure time usually means cooler temperatures. This exposure results in mild hyperthermia, not hypo, an increase in the body's core temperature that induces a thermoregulatory response involving various mechanisms that participate in restoring homeostasis and conditioning the body for just future stresses, a similar way that exercise would, in the sense you are challenging the body and then it wants to maintain homeostasis, and therefore it's better able to cope with future stresses, aka pedaling your bike again, for example. The Finnish style of using a sauna involves 1 to 3 sessions of heat exposure lasting 5 to 20 minutes, with the longer session showing more robust health benefits in studies, with periods of cooling placed in between each of these sessions, which is where the cold therapy comes in. The method used to cool off varies from jumping into snow or immersing yourself in like cold water. So obviously we would probably use cold water. We'd either a tub of water outside the house, just like a little paddling pool essentially, or you're talking an ice bath or so on and so forth. But it's the cooling effect. Obviously in Finland during the winter, jump outside in the snow, happy days. The idea being that this will stress the body even further past what's already occurring with the hot exposure, and by doing them together you're getting more of a benefit than just hot on its own, cold on its own. Now, it is known that periodic exposure to both hot and cold helps improve vascular function due to the body changing the level of cooling or heat retention it needs to employ. Now, when jumping between extremes, the extreme gradient accelerates the transition and is meant to further improve this function, probably just the increased stress, to be honest, a bit like doing 400 watts on the bike and leading to a rapid increase in, for example, VO2, assuming 400 watts is your VO2 kind of power. When an individual returns to the sauna after a swim in the ice cold water or in the snow or whatever it is, the effect is evidenced by a swelling or swollen hands and legs together with strong pulsation sensations, as the blood flow is strongly stimulated by the extreme variations in temperature. And that is the challenge happening right there. Your body is going through this drastic change and trying to cope with it and maintain homeostasis, and therefore some kind of adaptation is going to be triggered. Now, we mentioned earlier the underlying mechanisms and the physiological response and / effects to heat stress, but let's now go into them in greater detail. Now, exposure to high temperatures stresses the body, triggering a rapid response that primarily affects the skin and the cardiovascular system. They're working in tandem to control this. Now, the skin, being the direct contact with the hot air, heats up first, reaching approximately 40 degrees Celsius. The core body temperature initially rises slowly from 37 and then to around 38 before increasing more rapidly to approximately 39. Why this is, I'm not actually sure. I think it's like a soaking effect, or how long it takes for the blood to actually really start being funneled to the skin and sweat to start appearing, and for the cooling process to start happening or to saturate properly. I'm not as certain, but that's what was stated. Now, the cardiovascular response during the heat exposure, the cardiac output can increase by as much as 60 to 70%, and the heart rate can reach up to 150 beats per minute while you are sat down, which highlights how great a stress this is, which also highlights, later on, we'll touch on it a bit, but how obviously heat acclimation for athletes is so important. Because imagine, obviously you're not going to be trying to exercise at like 80 degrees C, but say it is a hotter temperature than you're used to. There's this already initial level of cardiac load that's occurring. In this case, it's pretty significant because it's 150 beats per minute. Now you're then trying to exercise at the same time that there's already this load on the system. You're not going to be able to do what you used to do. Now, whilst the stroke volume remains stable at the same time as this increased cardiac load. Now, about 50 to 70% of the body's circulation is redirected from the core to the skin to facilitate sweating. This results in fluid loss rate that can range from 0.6 of a kilo to an entire kilogram per hour, with an average loss of around 0.5 of a kilo during a moderate temperature finished our sauna session, which is 80 to 70 degrees is what they class as moderate. Now, acute heat exposure also induces an increase in overall plasma volume, which helps mitigate the decrease in cord blood volume. This increase in plasma volume provides a reserve source of fluid for sweating and aids in cooling the body, prevents rapid increase in core body temperature, and enhances heat tolerance. This is something that also happens very quickly with exercise. We know that when you first, your total blood volume or plasma volume is the first thing that drops off quickly and is the first thing that comes back very quickly, or maybe one of the first things, maybe not the first thing, but it is something that returns quickly, and for this reason, one, transporting fuel, but also because of this reserve, as they describe it, for heat rejection and so on. As mentioned already, repeated sauna use acclimates the body to heat and optimizes the response to future heat exposure. Now, this adaptation is likely due to hormesis, and a biological phenomenon where exposure to mild stressor triggers a compensatory defense response that is disproportionate to the magnitude of the stressor. Obviously, you want to sort of overcompensate to some extent. Now, hormesis activates a range of protective mechanisms that not only repair cell damage but also provide protection against subsequent exposures to more severe stressors. Now, we've spoken about exercise and compared it to exercise a lot. Now, many physiological responses to sauna use are remarkably similar to those experienced during moderate to vigorous intensity aerobic exercise. This similarity has led to the proposition, shall we say, that sauna use could serve as an alternative to aerobic exercise for individuals who are unable to engage in physical activity due to chronic disease or physical limitations. However, it's important to emphasize that exercise should be prioritized when possible, as it offers more comprehensive benefits, including greater muscular function, muscular perfusion, and larger scale adaptations in general. It's a greater stressor, results in greater responses, whereas hot and cold therapy can offer all the same things to a lesser extent. And when used in tandem, it can be a potent tool, but this is definitely not you do hot and cold therapy 3 hours a week, don't worry about exercise. That's definitely not what it is. But to kind of summarize it, while sauna bathing provides significant health benefits and can serve as a useful adjunct to exercise, it should not be considered a replacement for physical activity. Exercise remains the primary method for achieving extensive cardiovascular and muscular adaptations. For those who can exercise, incorporating sauna sessions can enhance overall health and improve heat tolerance. And then for those who cannot, sauna use offers a valuable alternative to gain some of the benefits associated with aerobic exercise. I think maybe if you're injured, like severely, say you're on the bike, break a collarbone, or you break your hand, or whatever it is, where you're still able to get about, it's just you need to spend a bit of time away from the bike. This can be definitely something that maybe even it will keep the plasma volume a bit higher if you're off for like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks or whatever. Not so certain, but essentially this is not a substitute for exercise, really. Now, what about heat shock proteins and brown fat? These are like the hot and cold therapy, sauna use, ice bath, like bingo words. They're like the heat shock proteins, HSPs. I feel like they're the golden apple. Anyway, so heat shock proteins. Let's start with them. Heat shock proteins are a crucial adaptive response to heat stress, playing a significant role in numerous cellular processes. Now, immune function, so HSPs, we'll call them, assist in the proper functioning of the immune system by ensuring proteins involved in immune responses maintain their structure and function. Cell signaling and cycle regulation is another thing. They are involved in this signaling pathways and the regulation of the cell cycle, ensuring cells respond appropriately to stress and damage. HSPs also help maintain the stability and proper functioning of the proteome, the entire set of proteins expressed by a cell, tissue, or organism. There's an element of also in aging where loss of proteome integrity is a hallmark of aging. Damaged and dysfunctional proteins accumulate in age-related diseases like cardiovascular and neurodegenerative disorders. And then HSPs repair these damaged proteins, potentially mitigating some of the effects of aging. Animal studies suggest that HSPs might offer protection against neurodegenerative diseases by preventing protein aggregation and assisting in the repair of damaged proteins. And again, HSPs also help moderate muscle atrophy, another hallmark of aging, by protecting muscle proteins from damage. Now, a study of Danish nonagenarians, people aged 90 to 99, showed that women with specific single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, in the HSP70 gene, which increases the gene stability and activity, lived about 1 year longer than those without these SNPs. 30 minutes in a 73-degree room can increase heat shock protein levels by up to 49%, with a sustained increase in heat acclimation in individuals. Then we get on to brown fat, or brown adipose tissue, or BAT. And brown adipose tissue differs from white adipose tissue in function and distribution. So, BAT is a localized small deposits around the body, mainly in the neck area, and is activated by cold exposure. Now, unlike white adipose tissue, or WAT, which stores fat, BAT burns energy to produce heat. It's like a fuel essentially, but for heat production only. Now, BAT activation contributes to energy expenditure and heat production, playing a role in maintaining body temperature in response to the cold. This process is known as non-shivering thermogenesis, so making heat without shivering. And shivering is our predominant, method of heating ourselves in incidences of severe cold, basically, as we all know. Now, a colder environment correlates with higher brown fat activation and lower overall body weight. Repeated cold exposure increases brown fat's oxidative capacity and its activity, leading to changes in lipid metabolism. BAT activation can potentially prevent body adiposity and related metabolic and cardiovascular disorders. However, glucose metabolism was also important, as it's impaired in the BAT of type 2 diabetic patients. Now, shivering, as I've already mentioned, skeletal muscles contribute to heat production through shivering, which can increase heat production nearly 5 times that of baseline, it was impressive the first time I read it. However long ago I made this podcast, a year ago maybe. Second time reading it, third time reading it, fourth time reading it, it just amazes me most of the time what the human body is capable of. I've always found it that things man themselves have made, can impress me, can intrigue me, but it's kind of like a logical mind approach to it. I'm like, oh, yeah, you may have done that, thought of that, then achieved this, and so on and so forth. But it's these innate mechanisms within us that are just so impressive. And imagine trying to create a human, essentially. All these different mechanisms, all these different hormones, all these different organs, all these different things collaborating in one squishy box that just seem to work well and occasionally have malfunctions, but once you get around the whole chance of death by being killed by something, you're pretty robust for the most part. And I find it quite impressive. Now, what is the extent of that? Because this is the thing that you know, when you get the not top, but you get someone who's sort of well read on it, really wants to explain it, and identifies the fact that this brown is talking about, say, VO2 max training, and they go, yeah, you're going to see huge improvements, say like a 10% uplift on your VO2 max, right? But then they say, but remember, if you're doing just VO2 max for the next 10 years, one, you're probably not doing many sessions a week, and two, you're going to plateau pretty quickly. You also need to introduce some low intensity work and year on year build on it, do some threshold work, so on and so forth. Then you get the person who just goes, yeah, the most effective way to increase your VO2 max is by doing VO2 max training, and then stops there. And it's like, yeah, that's true, but then someone reading this or listening to this is going to go, yeah, I'm just going to do VO2 max training all the time. This is an instance of where I think that's the case, where you hear the brown fat thing. Purely brown fat thermogenesis contributes to energy consumption of less than 20 calories per day. This minimal impact highlights the need for substantial browning of white fat to see significant metabolic effects. If we compare it to exercise, the energy expenditure from brown adipose tissue activation is minimal compared to that from moderate intensity physical activity. When I say moderate intensity, I mean just moving. So for instance, brisk walking or moderate intensity running for just 2 minutes can match the energy consumption of brown adipose tissue. Let's look at my power data from a 40-minute ride to work, talking like 400, 500 calories when I'm just tapping along. Obviously it's more nuanced than that, but this brown, you're not going to carry on eating what you do if you're like, I don't know, 5'5" and 100 kilos, and then start doing ice baths and this brown adipose tissue add up, and then you're suddenly eating 3,000 calories a day at 140 centimeters, and suddenly you're like, oh, I'm now 55 kilos. It doesn't work like that. As much as it would be great to just take an ice bath a day and now be super lean, like 10%, 15% body fat just from doing that. But there is merit behind the brown body fat, brown adipose tissue, but it isn't going to really change things an awful lot, really, unfortunately. All right, so the benefits of hot and cold exposure on longevity. Now, we've kind of really, to some extent, covered a lot of it in different ways, but to consolidate, so we've got cardiovascular health. Now, heat exposure, such as saunas use, induces protective responses that promote cardiovascular health, mirroring some of the benefits of exercise. Now, during moderate temperature sauna sessions, heart rate can rise to 100 BPM and can even get up to 150 BPM in hotter sessions. Now, similar to low to moderate intensity exercise, the benefits are going to be in line in the sense of what's occurring, not in their magnitude, however. Now, regular sauna use decreases both systolic and diastolic blood pressure, enhances left ventricular ejection fraction, reduces left ventricular ejection time, improves arterial compliance, and enhances endothelial function. So simply, cardiovascular health as a blanket term is greatly, or is improved. Maybe I shouldn't say greatly, it's just improved. Now, studies indicate that dose-dependent relationship between sauna use and cardiovascular benefits, same as exercise. For instance, men who use sauna 2 to 3 times per week had a 22% lower risk of sudden cardiac death, while those who use it 4 to 7 times per week had a 63% lower risk compared to those who use it on only a once a week basis. Now, longer sauna sessions also correlated with greater reductions in risk. Combining aerobic exercise with frequent sauna use results in the most significant reduction in cardiovascular related mortality and all-cause mortality. Now, this obviously sort of underscores the importance of exercise with the sauna use and the additional beneficial practice. I've always sort of wondered when I was revisiting this, like, and I'm not advising or advocating for any of this. I'm just merely like thinking to myself is that when you get into, say, older age, maybe you are less likely, I don't know, maybe the intensity of which your exercise is, because this is the thing, 150 BPM if you're old, probably not a good idea. But is this a practice that can apply to people in old age, like when you're 70? Maybe just doing a lighter, like 40-degree session, keeping it short. Could these benefits be important? Or is just walking, as long as you're not at risk, high risk of falling, is it just a better idea? I don't know, but it just sort of popped into my mind. Like, is there a point where the curve of risk / to reward ratio benefits sauna use over exercise, when the risk of being outside and being active / and the chance of falling increases? Is that a thing? I'm not sure, but just hypothesizing. HRV, which all athletes, love that stuff. Sauna use affects HRV, similar to exercise by engaging the autonomic nervous system. And HRV is a measure of variation in time between heartbeats, increases with improved autonomic function. Now, sauna use initially decreases HRV by activating the sympathetic nervous system, but ultimately leads to increased HRV post-session, indicating improved autonomic balance. So essentially, when your heartbeat becomes more rhythmic, I suppose you could say it is rhythmic, but anyway, more cookie cutter, like 4/4 time signature, like bum, 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 is a lower HRV, which is in line with stressors. So whether that's work stress, whether that's cycling stress, that's what happens. And then when you recover, it becomes more like bum, 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 bum. Not quite that, but anyway. So there you go. Inflammation. Chronic inflammation is linked to many diseases, including cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. Now, both exercise and sauna use induce a beneficial inflammatory response that includes the release of anti-inflammatory cytokines. Now, this response is partially due to the increase in core body temperature. And sauna use being passive activity may partially beneficial for individuals who cannot participate in regular exercise due to physical cognitive limitations. That's where I was trying to get to with the elderly. Like, if you are more physically limited and it's just a bigger strain on your body doing, like, say, let's say 10 hours of walking a week. Say you were able to do that, like you go on like a couple long walks and then some other walks here and there, and it accumulates to 10 hours of time on your feet. At 60, at 70, maybe it's too much, but you can still drive down to the gym, walk to the sauna, whatever it is, and get in the sauna for half an hour or whatever at a moderate temperature. Is that then the point, is what I was trying to get to, of is that where this sort of risk to reward curves sort of kind of cross paths? But you've also got the neurodegenerative disease benefits. Now, heat stress exercise increases the expression of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, promoting the growth of new neurons. The study of middle-aged men in Finland found that those who used the sauna 4 to 7 times per week had a 65% reduced risk of developing Alzheimer's disease compared to those who used it once a week. And then improved cardiovascular health from sauna use supports better cerebral blood flow, which is crucial for cognitive function and prevents hypertension-related cerebral blood flow impairments. Now, heat shock proteins, which increase the sauna use, play a critical role in preventing neurodegenerative diseases by maintaining protein homeostasis and protecting against protein aggregation. Whenever I read stuff like that, I always go a bit like exercise. Obviously, exercise, we know for, like, no one's going to tell you it's bad for you. But obviously, when you get a number like 65% reduced risk of developing Alzheimer's from sauna use, is it that these people who are 4 to 7 times per week are just generically more active, healthier, so on and so forth, than the people who do it less often? You never know. So you always have to take it with a pinch of salt, but it's like 65%. Well, what it's telling you, like I always say, is studies don't necessarily tell you what to do, but not what not to do. And in this case, they're not telling you not to go to the sauna. Yeah, it's not showing you that it is harmful to your health. Now, this next bit on the endocrine system, essentially, part of this study suggested that 20-minute sauna session at 80 degrees C repeated by a 30-minute cooling period can double growth hormone levels, while 2 15-minute sessions at 100 degrees C resulted in a 5-fold. And then later down there it says a 1-hour sauna session at 80 degrees C per day for 7 days increased growth hormone levels by 16-fold. These were huge increases, to the point that I now revisiting it with my more skeptical mind is like, what were the levels before? How badly were these people down on it? But also, yeah, there's just no figures quoted here, and also there's no suggestion to how long this spike in growth hormone is. So I was a bit skeptical on it and just sort of wanted to add it there as if you read the study yourself or find one suggesting this, just to look at it as like, I don't think you're going to replace any kind of hormonal replacements and stuff with this. So I just looked at it a bit dubious. Maybe my understanding's not good enough, but I was just a little bit like meh of this. Anyway, there's also some preservation of muscle mass and whole in these saunas, suggesting that increased activity in AKT-mTOR pathway, which is critical for maintaining skeletal muscle mass and promoting mitochondrial biogenesis. Cold exposure, such as the activation of brown adipose tissue, contributes to energy expenditures, I've already kind of mentioned. And there was an idea that it improves some kind of metabolic health in general. Obviously, we've highlighted the fact that it's not exactly a high caloric expenditure. Now, when you come back to cardiovascular fitness, physical fitness is obviously a critical component of human health and strong independent predictor of mortality. And there's always that study talking about just being above average, giving you this 3x increase in or reduction in all-cause mortality, which obviously hopefully gets people to move and do exercise. But many factors contributing to physical fitness decline with age. For example, maximum oxygen consumption, or VO2 max, declines by approximately 10% per decade of life, regardless of activity level. Maintaining physical fitness in older adults is associated with preserved cognitive function, reduced fertility, and an overall improved quality of I just said reduced fertility. Reduced frailty and an overall improved quality of life. Now, heat stress from sauna use may contribute to improvements in physical fitness by increasing cardiorespiratory fitness, endurance, and preserving muscle mass. A similar intervention study investigated the effects of repeated sauna use on endurance and other physiological effects in 6 male distance runners. The findings showed that the 30-minute sauna session twice per week for 3 weeks post-workout increased time to exhaustion by 32% compared to their baseline. Now, these endurance improvements were accompanied by 7.1% increased plasma volume, 3.5% increase in erythrocyte, red blood cells. Now, during exercise, red blood cells transport oxygen from the lungs to the body tissue and deliver carbon dioxide to lungs for expiration. This is something that came up in my episode on heat acclimation and this potential idea of it being the poor man's altitude training and whether doing it was essentially worth it. I mean, the evidence from the study seemed pretty legitimate and seemed like a valid piece of information, but that was specifically to be done with athletes in mind, not necessarily that you would do that without exercise to compensate for your lack of exercise, unless you, again, can't exercise. That's what it comes down to, is the adaptions and the benefits are similar to that of exercise. However, they're orders of magnitude different. So, don't use this as an alternative. But yeah, if you are recreationally active and you exercise like 5 hours a week, say for example, or 6 hours a week, and you knock off 1 hour, so have one of these sauna sessions, yeah, fine. It's more if you exercise 3 hours a week and decide to stop exercising the 3 hours a week and do 3 hours of sauna session, that's where this is suggesting that's not a good idea. Now, concerns and drawbacks, of course, there's a concern, and of course, there's a drawback to these any kind of modality. One of them being male fertility. Now, heat exposure has notable, though reversible, effects on male sperm fertility measures. A study involving 10 healthy men who underwent 2 15-minute sauna sessions at 80 degrees, between 80 to 90 degrees, every week for 3 months found a reduction in sperm counts and more motility. These measures returned to normal within 6 months after discontinuing sauna use. So essentially, if you're trying to have a child, you don't go to the sauna because clearly it has a negative impact. Why? Whether it's just your body's not capable of, obviously, like the temperature management, hence why your testicles are able to move away from your body and move towards your body. Clearly, just that mechanism isn't strong enough to cope with an 80-degree ambient temperature, and so just clearly some of them die off, I suppose. Don't try conceive and also go to the sauna. Now, considerations for pregnant women is an interesting one. That now the safety of sauna use during pregnancy is less clear and should be approached with caution. While Finnish women commonly continue sauna use during pregnancy, they typically do so at reduced temperatures and exposure. I suppose the same as you do with exercise. You wouldn't go try run a marathon while you were however many weeks pregnant. It's just sort of, to some extent, common sense. The stressor, you're already under stress. You've also got another growing organism in you which is less capable of dealing with stressors and is making you less capable of dealing with stressors. So don't stress your body too much. Children actually have less efficient thermoregulatory mechanisms compared to adults due to differences in their anatomy and physiology. They have lower sweat rates, which can compromise their ability to dissipate body heat through evaporation, making them less able to cope with prolonged sauna exposure. And therefore, sauna use in children tends to be limited and monitored a bit more closely. There's obviously the risk of dehydration, as we mentioned, 0.5 to a kilo dehydration in an hour. So proper hydration, maintaining electrolyte balance are crucial to avoid dehydration. And I suppose if you're doing one session at an hour, it's bear in mind that coming into it, you want to be well hydrated, and coming out of it to hydrate, or just drinking all the way through, for example. So optimizing your hydration levels. And then there's just the general kind of precautions that they advise. So sauna use should be approached with caution, and particularly for individuals with certain health conditions such as cardiovascular disease and respiratory issues or low blood pressure. It's important to listen to your body and exit the sauna if you feel dizzy, lightheaded or unwell. Consulting a healthcare provider before starting regular sauna use is always recommended, especially for those with pre-existing health conditions. So other heat stress modalities, I think, is an important thing to discuss because saunas are expensive, / not necessarily readily available to all. So you may be wondering what other methods exist to achieve the benefits of heat exposure. Now, given the reasonable barrier to entry that both ice baths and saunas present, these methods can be costly and, as I've said, logistically a bit challenging, and making them harder to stick to if you would like to do them consistently, or taking more time out of your day if you just wanted to. If you had a sauna at your home and it's just a 40-minute session, it's there. Whereas if you have to go to the gym and you're not already going there, for example, then it's again a bigger barrier to entry. Now, fortunately, there are alternative strategies for elevating core body temperature that can also provide favorable effects to the cardiovascular and central nervous system. These include the use of hot water blankets, hypothermic baths, heating coils, or specialized lamps that emit infrared radiation in a confined area or chamber. These are those infrared saunas that you can get. So warm water immersion. Hot water immersion, particularly hot baths, can elicit beneficial effects on several markers of cardiac health. For instance, frequent hot water bathing more than 5 times per week has been associated with lower biomarkers of atherosclerosis and lower markers of cardiac loading, which is a measure of cardiac function and function. The temperature and frequency of hot water baths show dose-dependent effects like every other bit of stuff we've discussed already. Now, hot water baths also have shown to increase the presence of heat shock proteins, which are biomarkers of heat stress. And a study demonstrated that waist down immersion in 40 degrees C hot water for 1 hour significantly increased the levels of heat shock proteins. Additionally, hot baths can enhance the cerebral blood flow, particularly in the frontal lobe, which is beneficial for brain health. Now, 40 degrees C is pretty easily obtained. Your boiler, your hot water tank definitely holds water hotter than that to, prevent bacteria. So it's very easily achievable. Now, keeping the water that warm, a bit less achievable, but you can buy sort of toppers to go on top. I did have a look out of curiosity. Last time I did this, you could buy moderately inexpensive ones to keep a lot of that heat in. And then also you can just start with the bath being hotter than 40 degrees and then letting it cool slowly. But again, the similar benefit. There's also discussions of, for example, when it comes to improved athletic performance, coming back from a session where your core temperature is already elevated, particularly intervals, and then quickly transitioning to the hot bath, and that stimulus can show very favorable improvements in performance. Now, cold baths, especially if you're doing this, it's mainly the cooling effect, so you don't necessarily need an ice bath. The harder the transition, the better, but just using a cold shower, for example, especially if your bath and shower are next to each other, you can jump out of the bath, jump into the shower quickly, douse yourself, cool yourself down, and then get back in the bath. This can be a valid method for achieving this sort of yo-yoing effect between the hot and cold environments. Now, while traditional methods like saunas and ice baths offer significant health benefits, these alternative strategies such as hot water immersion and the use of infrared lamps can also be effective. Funnily enough, a gym I went to at one point recently, they actually had these infrared lamps in a infrared sauna. Whether they're cheaper or what, I don't know. Never used one personally. Only ever been in a traditional kind of like a wet sauna, shall we call it, where you chuck the moisture on the hot rocks, and quite relaxing actually. It was at a hotel before many years ago now, actually, I'd say, before a big rugby match, a big final, and just sat in there for about 30 minutes, just cooking away, and it did feel good. I must say, it did feel good. So I don't know. Now we come to the end of the episode. What do you think? Did you hear the initial delivery? Is there anything new you learned? Is there anything you are still curious about? What do you think? Are you reconsidering doing hot and cold exposure? I personally just prioritize training at the moment. I don't do any of these other additional modalities. If I was targeting a big event, this is coming more back to the performance side of things. In the heat, yes, I would do heat acclimation right now with no big events like that, want like singular big targeted events. I don't do anything like this. But what do you think? Now, for more content like this, explore my previous episodes and consider following, rating, and sharing the podcast wherever you get your podcast from. Share your thoughts or suggest future topics to the VO2Lounge@gmail.com, or the VO2 Lounge Discord server, which is also linked down below. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it's goodbye.